Restaurant owner bans Melania Trump for wearing MAGA. What happens next shocks everyone. It was an ordinary lunch hour at the Golden Fork, a high-end restaurant nestled in the heart of downtown. The place was known for its upscale ambience, craft cocktails, and a strict unwritten rule: no political symbols or controversial statements allowed. Steve Harper, the owner, watched his staff with hawk-like precision as they bustled around, serving customers with polished efficiency. He prided himself on maintaining a refined atmosphere where nothing disrupted the serene dining experience. The door swung open, and the soft hum of conversation faltered for a brief moment. In walked Melania Trump, wearing a crisp button-down shirt, designer jeans, and a red MAGA hat that caught everyone's attention. Steve immediately tensed. He had dealt with public figures before, but this was different. The hat, bold, unmistakable, sent a clear message. His eyes narrowed as he walked toward the hostess stand, where Melania stood, her presence calm and poised. The hostess greeted her with a nervous smile. "Welcome to the Golden Fork. Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Melania said with her signature grace. "It should be under my name, Melania." The hostess checked the list and nodded. "Yes, we have your table ready." Before the hostess could lead her to the table, Steve stepped in. "Excuse me," he said, his tone polite but firm. "I'm afraid we have a policy here. We don't allow political attire of any kind. I'm going to have to ask you to remove the hat or leave." Melania raised an eyebrow, her expression composed. "I see. And this policy, is it written anywhere?" Steve hesitated. "It's an unspoken rule. We try to avoid any political statements to keep things neutral for our guests." A murmur spread through the restaurant as diners watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Phones were discreetly lifted, cameras recording the unfolding scene. "I appreciate your explanation," Melania said calmly. "But I'm afraid I won't be removing my hat. If that means I must leave, then so be it." Steve crossed his arms, standing his ground. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but that's the way it is." Without another word, Melania turned and walked out, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. The door closed behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Within minutes, a video of the incident surfaced online. The clip, captioned "Melania Trump kicked out of restaurant for wearing MAGA hat," spread like wildfire. News outlets picked it up almost immediately, and before the lunch rush was even over, Steve's phone was flooded with calls from reporters demanding a comment. The reactions were swift and polarizing. Supporters of the restaurant praised Steve's stance, while others were outraged by what they saw as blatant discrimination. #MelaniaBanned began trending on social media, and protests started forming outside the Golden Fork. Steve tried to brush it off at first. "It'll blow over," he told his staff. These things always do. But it didn't blow over. Each hour brought new headlines, new debates on television, and an ever-growing crowd outside the restaurant. Protesters carried signs reading "Free speech for all" and "Respect all opinions." Meanwhile, online reviews plummeted as angry commenters left scathing feedback. At home, Melania watched the media frenzy unfold with a quiet sense of detachment. She had learned long ago not to react impulsively. Instead, she waited, observing how the situation evolved. Her phone buzzed with messages from friends and family, urging her to respond. Even her PR team suggested issuing a formal statement. But Melania had other plans. The next day, she called her assistant. "Schedule a press conference," she said. "It's time to set the record straight." The following afternoon, a media storm gathered outside the Liberty Hall, where Melania Trump was set to hold her press conference. Journalists, photographers, and curious onlookers filled the street, buzzing with anticipation. Inside, Melania prepared calmly. She wore a simple blue blouse, her demeanor composed and confident. This wasn't her first time addressing the public during a crisis, and she knew the importance of controlling the narrative. When she finally stepped up to the podium, the crowd fell silent, cameras flashing as she took a deep breath. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for being here today." The air felt heavy with expectation as every eye locked onto her. "As many of you know, I was recently asked to leave a restaurant for wearing a hat," specifically a MAGA hat, Melania continued. Since then, the situation has grown into something far larger than I ever intended. She paused for a moment, allowing her words to sink in. I want to make one thing very clear, she said. I do not hold any anger or resentment toward the restaurant owner. We live in a country where people are free to make their own choices, and that includes business owners. However, it is also important to recognize the value of respect and open dialogue, even when we disagree. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Her response was far more measured and gracious than many had expected. In moments like these, we have a choice, Melania said. We can choose to react with anger and division, or we can choose to rise above it and seek understanding. I prefer the latter. The room burst into applause, flashes from cameras illuminating her serene expression. Her message was simple yet powerful, grace in the face of conflict. Back at the Golden Fork, Steve watched the press conference from his office, his face pale. He had expected a harsh condemnation, public humiliation, but instead, Melania had responded with kindness and forgiveness. For the first time since the incident, Steve felt the weight of his actions truly settle on him. He had acted impulsively, driven more by his own biases than any legitimate policy. And now, he realized how wrong he had been. He sat in silence for a long time, thinking. The phones continued to ring and the protests outside grew louder, but all he could hear were Melania's words playing over and over in his head. We can choose to react with anger, or we can choose understanding. Finally, he stood and walked out to the front of the restaurant, where his staff anxiously waited for direction. We need to make this right, he said, his voice firm but sincere. I made a mistake, and it's time we own up to it. That evening, Steve released a public statement. To our valued customers and the broader community, it began. In light of recent events, I want to sincerely apologize to Mrs. Melania Trump. My decision to ask her to leave was wrong and did not reflect the values of respect and inclusivity that we strive to uphold. I take full responsibility for my actions and regret the hurt they caused. He went on to acknowledge his mistake and promised to implement new policies that fostered an environment of openness and understanding. The response was immediate. While some remained skeptical of his sincerity, many others were willing to give him a second chance. A few days later, Steve received an envelope in the mail. It was cream-colored with a gold seal on the back. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling slightly. Inside was a handwritten note from Melania. Dear Steve, it read, thank you for your thoughtful apology. We all make mistakes. It's how we respond to them that truly defines us. I wish you and your restaurant nothing but success in the future. Best regards, Melania. Steve stared at the note for a long moment, his eyes misting over. It was a humbling experience. He had braced himself for anger and retaliation but had been met with grace and compassion instead. It was something he would never forget. In the following weeks, the Golden Fork began to rebuild. The protests faded, and the media moved on to the next big story. But something had shifted in the restaurant's culture. Steve took his lesson to heart, organizing workshops for his staff on empathy, conflict resolution, and customer service. The experience had changed him, and he was determined to create a welcoming environment for everyone who walked through the door. One evening, as the dinner rush began, Steve noticed a couple wearing MAGA hats sitting at a corner table. For a brief moment, his heart skipped a beat. But then he smiled, walked over to their table, and greeted them warmly. Welcome to the Golden Fork, he said. We're so glad to have you here. The couple smiled back, completely at ease. Steve knew in that moment that things had truly changed. The transformation of the Golden Fork soon became a case study in redemption and growth. News outlets ran follow-up stories about the restaurant's remarkable turnaround, praising Steve's willingness to admit his mistake and make amends. The restaurant thrived, not because of the controversy, but because of the community that grew around it. Customers appreciated the authenticity and warmth that now define the experience. And Steve never forgot the lesson he had learned. Humility, kindness, and the power of second chances can turn even the worst mistakes into opportunities for growth. Months later, Steve stood outside the restaurant, watching the sunset. The air was cool, and the city lights sparkled in the distance. He thought about how far he had come, how much he had learned, and how grateful he was for the journey. Every misstep, every hard lesson, every moment of growth. His phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Keep going, Steve. The best is yet to come." He smiled, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Because in the end, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about mistakes. It was about people, connecting, understanding, and always striving to do better. And Steve knew that, no matter what, he was ready for whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, the transformation at the Golden Fork was nothing short of extraordinary. What had once been an exclusive, high-end spot with a rigid, unspoken set of rules had evolved into a place where people from all walks of life felt welcome. The air inside the restaurant felt lighter, conversations warmer, and the staff more connected than ever. Steve dedicated himself to fostering a more inclusive culture, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it felt good to truly listen and understand the people around him. Every day was an opportunity to learn something new, to connect on a deeper level with his team and his customers. He implemented open dialogue days, where the restaurant hosted community events, inviting guest speakers to discuss empathy, tolerance, and the importance of bridging divides. The response was overwhelming. Regulars returned with new appreciation, and new customers came curious to experience the restaurant's new philosophy. One afternoon, while Steve was preparing for a busy dinner shift, he received a surprise visitor. The door swung open, and in walked Melania Trump. She wasn't alone this time. She was accompanied by a small group of friends, all dressed elegantly yet casually. Melania wore a simple white blouse and jeans, her demeanor as poised and gracious as ever. The restaurant fell silent for a moment as heads turned. Then, almost instinctively, the entire staff straightened up, determined to deliver the best service possible. Steve's heart raced, but he quickly composed himself and walked over to greet her. "Mrs. Trump," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to see you again. Welcome back to the Golden Fork." Melania shook his hand with a warm smile. "Thank you, Steve. I've been hearing about all the wonderful changes you've made, and I wanted to see it for myself." "We're glad to have you," Steve said. "Please, let me show you to our best table." As Melania and her friends settled in, Steve personally oversaw every detail of their meal. He made sure everything was perfect, from the appetizers to the desserts, while discreetly keeping an eye on how his staff handled the high-pressure situation. They did wonderfully. Every server was attentive without being overbearing, every dish came out flawlessly, and the atmosphere remained relaxed and welcoming. When the meal was over, Melania stood and walked over to Steve, her expression warm and sincere. "Steve," she said, "you've done something truly remarkable here. I'm proud of how far you've come." Her words hit him like a wave of emotion. For so long, Steve had carried the weight of his mistake, unsure if he could ever truly redeem himself. But in that moment, he knew he had. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." News of Melania's return spread quickly, but this time, the headlines were different. Melania Trump returns to the Golden Fork, a story of forgiveness and growth. Read one. Restaurant once embroiled in controversy becomes a beacon of change. Read another. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Customers flocked to the restaurant, not just for the food but for the experience, an experience that represented growth, resilience, and the power of second chances. In the months that followed, the Golden Fork became a symbol of transformation. Steve received invitations to speak at local business events, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned. At first, he was hesitant. Public speaking wasn't exactly his strength, but he soon realized that his story resonated with people. He spoke about the power of humility, the importance of listening, and how failure can be a stepping stone to something far greater. Every time he finished a talk, people approached him to share their own stories, thanking him for his honesty and inspiration. One woman, a small business owner, told him how she had faced a similar crisis and nearly closed her doors. "Hearing your story gave me the courage to keep going," she said. "And it worked. My business is stronger than ever." But perhaps the most meaningful part of the journey was what happened within the restaurant itself. Steve's staff flourished under his new leadership. Many of them took on new roles and responsibilities, growing both professionally and personally. One of his longest-serving employees, Laura, who had been a server for years, was promoted to manager. "Laura," Steve told her during the promotion, "you've always been the heart of this place. It's time for everyone else to see it." Laura teared up, hugging him tightly. "Thank you, Steve. I won't let you down." The community embraced the Golden Fork's transformation wholeheartedly. Families who had once avoided the restaurant now made it their go-to spot for celebrations. Local organizations began hosting events there, recognizing it as a symbol of unity and understanding. Steve found himself busier than ever but more fulfilled than he'd ever been. His days were long, but they were filled with meaning and purpose. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Steve stood outside the restaurant, watching the lights twinkle in the distance. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly baked bread from the kitchen. He thought about everything that had brought him to this moment. The mistakes, the lessons, the unexpected friendships. It had been a long, winding road, but he wouldn't change a thing. His phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Melania. "Steve, just wanted to say congratulations on everything you've built. You've turned something difficult into something truly beautiful. Keep going. The best is yet to come." Steve smiled, typing a quick response. "Thank you for believing in me. None of this would have been possible without your kindness." He slipped his phone back into his pocket and took a deep breath. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was this: every mistake is an opportunity to grow, every failure a chance to become something better. And Steve was ready for whatever came next. In the year that followed, the Golden Fork evolved into something much greater than Steve had ever imagined. It wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a symbol of second chances, a gathering place for the community, and a living testament to the power of change. Steve dedicated himself fully to this new mission, creating partnerships with local organizations and nonprofits. The restaurant began hosting monthly Second Chances dinners, where speakers would share stories of overcoming challenges, turning failures into triumphs, and building stronger futures. Each dinner ended with heartfelt conversations, new connections, and plenty of hugs from strangers who had found inspiration in the shared stories. It was during one of these dinners that Steve met Clara, a young woman with a story that struck a deep chord. She had been a rising star in the culinary world, only to lose everything after a business venture went terribly wrong. Clara had almost given up on her dream of being a chef. "I didn't think anyone would give me another chance," she told Steve, her voice trembling. "But hearing your story gave me hope." Steve smiled warmly. "Everyone deserves a second chance. You just need the right place to start again." That night, Clara joined the Golden Fork as a sous chef. Within months, her creativity and passion breathed new life into the menu, transforming it into something truly exceptional. "She's going to be a star," Steve told Laura one evening as they watched Clara prepare a new dish in the kitchen. "And I'm glad we get to be part of her journey." As the Golden Fork continued to thrive, Steve found himself reflecting more and more on how far he had come. There were moments, late at night when the restaurant was quiet, that he thought about the man he used to be: rigid, judgmental, and so focused on control that he forgot what really mattered. Now, things were different. He listened more. He laughed more. He welcomed challenges as opportunities to grow, rather than obstacles to be feared. But there was still one thing that lingered: a sense of unfinished business. One afternoon, Steve sat in his office, staring at a blank piece of paper. After a long pause, he began to write. "Dear Melania, I wanted to thank you once again, not just for your kindness and grace during a difficult time, but for the lesson you taught me. You reminded me of the power of understanding and forgiveness, and that lesson changed my life. It changed me. I will always be grateful for that. If you're ever in town again, I would love the chance to cook you dinner, not as an apology, but as a thank you. With warmest regards." He sealed the letter and sent it off, not knowing if he would ever hear back. Several weeks later, as Steve prepared for another busy dinner shift, a familiar figure appeared at the door. It was Melania, wearing a simple dress and her signature calm smile. Steve's heart leapt. He rushed to greet her, his eyes lighting up with surprise. "Mrs. Trump, what a wonderful surprise. "I received your letter," she said, "and I couldn't resist the invitation." "Well, in that case," Steve said with a grin, "let me make you the best meal you've ever had." That night, Steve personally cooked for Melania, crafting a special tasting menu that reflected the journey they had both been on, a blend of flavors and ingredients that told a story of transformation and hope. As the meal came to an end, Melania raised her glass in a toast. "To second chances," she said. "To second chances," Steve echoed, his heart full. The next day, a photo of Melania dining at the Golden Fork appeared on social media, accompanied by a simple caption, "A story of forgiveness, growth, and the power of change." "Thank you, Steve." The post went viral, sparking another wave of media attention. But this time, the headlines were nothing but positive. Restaurant owner once embroiled in controversy finds redemption, with help from Melania Trump. The Golden Fork becomes a national symbol of second chances. Steve was inundated with interview requests, speaking invitations, and letters from people all over the country who had been inspired by his journey. A few months later, Steve stood in front of a packed auditorium, preparing to give the biggest speech of his life. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady. "My name is Steve Harper, and I'm here to tell you a story about failure, forgiveness, and the unexpected beauty of second chances." He spoke about everything: the incident with Melania, the backlash, the hard lessons, and how it had all led to something greater than he ever imagined. He shared stories of the people he had met along the way, Clara, Jess, Laura, and how they had taught him as much as he had taught them. He finished with a simple message: "We all make mistakes, but those mistakes don't define us. What defines us is how we respond to them, how we learn, how we grow, and how we help others do the same." So, if you ever find yourself standing at a crossroads, unsure if you can recover from a failure, remember this: there's always a second chance waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to take it. The audience erupted in applause. As Steve stepped off the stage, he felt a deep sense of peace. He knew that this wasn't the end of his journey, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. And he couldn't wait to see where it would lead next. As Steve locked up the Golden Fork that evening, the cool night air wrapped around him like a gentle reminder of how far he had come. He gazed up at the stars, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude, not for the success or recognition, but for the people who had believed in him when he barely believed in himself. His phone buzzed one last time that night. It was a message from Melania. "The best journeys are the ones we never expect. Proud of you. Keep inspiring." Steve smiled, slipping his phone into his pocket. Because some second chances are just the beginning of something far greater. Over the next year, the Golden Fork became more than just a restaurant. It grew into a hub for connection, inspiration, and hope. The Second Chances dinners gained national recognition, with guests flying in from across the country to attend. Steve often found himself marveling at the diverse group of people that gathered under his roof: young entrepreneurs eager to learn, struggling business owners looking for encouragement, and everyday people who needed to be reminded that failure wasn't the end of their story. The restaurant continued to thrive, but for Steve, success was no longer measured by how many reservations they booked or how many awards they won. Instead, it was about the lives they touched, the people who walked in feeling lost and left feeling inspired. He made it a point to mentor as many people as he could, sharing his hard-earned wisdom with anyone who needed it. Sometimes, it was as simple as a conversation over coffee. Other times, it was months of guidance and support. No matter the situation, Steve always gave his full attention, knowing how much a kind word and a little encouragement could mean. One afternoon, Clara, now the head chef, approached Steve with an idea. "I've been thinking," she said, excitement shining in her eyes. "What if we opened a second location? A place with the same mission but in a different part of the city. We could reach even more people." Steve leaned back in his chair, considering her words. A second location was a big step, but he couldn't deny the potential. "I like the way you think," he said with a grin. "Let's make it happen." Within months, they had secured a space for the new restaurant. Clara led the charge on designing the menu, bringing in fresh ideas while staying true to the values that had made the Golden Fork so special. Steve focused on the bigger picture, ensuring that the new location embodied the same spirit of openness and growth. When the new restaurant finally opened, it was an overwhelming success. The grand opening drew a crowd that wrapped around the block, eager to be part of the next chapter. As he stood in the new dining room that night, watching the buzz of activity around him, Steve felt an unexpected wave of emotion. He thought back to where it all started, the mistake that had nearly cost him everything, and realized how much it had given him in return. If not for that moment, he wouldn't have met Clara or Jess or the countless others who had become such an important part of his life. He wouldn't have built something that mattered. He wouldn't be the man he was today. Later that evening, as he prepared to leave, Steve walked through the dining room one last time. The air was filled with laughter and conversation, the tables full of people from all walks of life. At the door, he paused and took one final look. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a place where stories began, where new chapters were written, and where anyone could find a second chance. Steve smiled, stepped outside, and disappeared into the cool night air. Because no matter what came next, he knew he had already found something far greater than success. He had found purpose.